Gotta level with you here. It's tough to find anything funny or entertaining to say about this one, but there are some interesting tidbits. The second episode of SNL is perhaps the strangest in that it looks unrecognizable compared to every other episode. The ensemble cast gets only one appearance, with the rest of the time mostly split between host Paul Simon and his three musical guests. Paul Simon is, of course, himself a musician, and not a particularly funny one at that. What we get then is something that more closely resembles an old-fashioned variety hour than the show ever would again. While it's totally understandable that SNL had yet to nail down its format and formula by episode 2, I'm personally glad that going forward the host wouldn't usually be such a dominating presence. Simon had appeared in a short filmed cameo in episode 1, announcing that he'd be hosting the next week. In Tom Shell's oral history live from New York, Simon mentions that he was up for hosting the first one, but Michaels turned him down. Lauren elaborates. It's always been a strategy of mine to try to make the second show hotter than the first because you want the ratings and the word of mouth to go up, and I thought Paul could do that. Now, Paul Simon certainly was a big deal in 1976, and the widely anticipated reunion with his ex-partner Art Garfunkel had drummed up a good deal of publicity. It's a shame, though, that rather than use the exposure to properly launch the show to a wider audience, Lauren essentially just aired The Paul Simon Show that week. Lauren actually would go on to produce a dedicated Simon TV special in 1977. It's considered a sort of SNL B-side by fans of the show, and features many of the cast members and writers. Perhaps I'll do a short video covering it someday. Paul brought with him publicity photos taken by Edie Baskin, who had been the one to initially introduce Paul to Lauren and who'd shot the cover of Paul's album Still Crazy After All These Years. Lauren liked the style so much he invited her back to photograph the host every week. She held the job until she passed it along to her protege Mary Ellen Matthews in 1999. In 1976, Paul was still riding high on the double Grammy-winning success of Still Crazy, which had produced 4 top 40 singles. This was certainly one of the most successful periods in Paul's career, and his performances here are all typically pristine. He opens with a serviceable if subdued rendition of Still Crazy. The song is a personal favorite of mine, but makes for a strange opening to what folks were probably expecting to be a more upbeat comedy show. We get a lovely cut to Michael Becker for the sax solo, but otherwise it's all Paul, until Chevy wanders on stage, trips over some chairs, and delivers the intro. Over the course of the evening, Paul would perform 7 songs, including a solo rendition of American Tune and guest Randy Newman's Marie, and 2 numbers with members of the backing band from the Still Crazy album, Loves Me Like a Rock and Gone at Last. According to a 2012 Rolling Stone article on this episode, guests Randy Newman and Phoebe Snow were already booked before the decision was made to have Paul Simon as the host. To accommodate performances by Simon and not cancel the others, the decision was made to almost completely forgo comedy for Week 2's show. I couldn't find any confirmation of this, but it makes sense in hindsight. Paul performs a brief but lovely acoustic guitar rendition of Newman's song Marie from 1974's Good Old Boys album, and then we cut to Newman at the piano for a solo performance of Sail Away, perhaps Newman's best-known song at the time. I'm unsure why Newman chose to play a song from a previous album instead of his most recent, but it's a strong performance, even though Newman looks visibly relieved when it's over. We'll get into more detail on Phoebe Snow when she guests again later this season. For this episode, a very pregnant Snow accompanies Paul on Gone at Last, which she'd also done on the Still Crazy album, and performs 30 standard No Regrets from a most recent record, Second Childhood. Certainly the highlight of the evening for most viewers, this advertised first reunion of Simon and Garfunkel was not actually the first time they'd performed since the breakup of the band in 1970. They'd played at least one show together in support of Walter Mondale's presidential campaign, and it's likely there'd been other one-offs around that time. I think it's easy to forget just how big a presence Simon and Garfunkel had been on the pop music scene just 5 or so years before SNL launched. They'd won a Grammy for Bridge Over Troubled Water, and were spoken of by critics in the same breaths as Bob Dylan and the Beatles. The fact that he chose to walk away from that kind of notoriety and try his hand at a solo record says something about Paul Simon, but his therapist would probably be better suited to say what it tells you than I could. At any rate, this performance was highly anticipated and doesn't disappoint. The segment begins with a frankly too long montage of photos of Simon and Garfunkel through the years. Paul introduces Art, who enters the stage to a standing ovation, which it turns out warm-up comic Richard Belzer suggestively coaxed from the audience before the show. After a bit of playful banter...
So, Artie, you've come crawling back.
It's very nice that you would invite me on your show, Paul. Thanks a lot.
The movies are over now? Little two-part harmony?
The two launch into old standards The Boxer and Scarborough Fair, accompanied by Paul and solo acoustic guitar, and then sing their collaborative single, My Little Town, to a backing track. Promoting this song, which appeared on both Paul and Artie's then current albums, probably was the reason this whole SNL reunion took place. You can't deny it probably helped sell some records. Perhaps to sweeten the deal for Artie, Paul also threw him a bone and let him perform I Only Have Eyes From You from Breakaway after the commercial break. Albert Brooks seemingly both wanted the audience to think he was very clever and also to kind of hate him a little, at least judging by the 9 pieces he aired on NBC's Saturday Night. He was hardly the first performer or filmmaker to adopt an anti-hero sort of persona, but golly, he does a good job of being unlikable in some of these films. By way of introducing the film, the host assures us,
You'll laugh.
but Paul Simon is a dirty liar with a bad 70s haircut. Brooks speaks directly to the camera, introducing us to his adorable daughter, whom he threatens with police arrest when she bites him, playing us some mortifying home movies of his abusive upbringing, and generally being off-putting and strange while trying to hype the audience up for all the time we'd be spending with him over the next few weeks. It doesn't work, at least not for me. The update this week is short and to the point. Just a nose pick, a few Ford jokes, and a random dig at Muhammad Ali, then on to this week's biggest misstep. Paul Simon versus Connie Hawkins, one-on-one. In later years, SNL frequently had to cut material in order to squeeze everything, including commercials, into an hour and a half. It would seem in the beginning they had the opposite problem, at least based on the insane 7-minute length of this entirely pointless pre-taped sketch. It's a one-joke premise to begin with. Paul Simon is really short, see, and not known for his athleticism? Let's have him challenge an NBA player to a game. Hilarity will surely ensue. It does not. Marv Albert interviews Paul before the game as to why this travesty is about to occur, and Paul seems to be as puzzled as the rest of us. We then have the dubious pleasure of spending nearly 5 minutes of our finite existence watching a Grammy-winning acoustic guitarist play a game of pickup basketball. I'm just gonna say it. This shouldn't have made the episode, and the ensemble should have gotten a sketch or two on instead. It's likely that the writers needed a week to recharge themselves after the first show, and that Lauren purposefully took the burden off of them this week by sliding in lots of things that weren't sketches. But the show suffers for it, in hindsight. This particular bit is just awful. It wins the first of what I'll jokingly call the coveted worst award thing winner. But going forward, I'll only award one of these in an episode when there's something truly and irredeemably awful. Every show might not have one, but if I don't mention something specific for a first season episode, you should just assume it's the effing Muppets. Jerry Rubin's Youth International Party, or Yippie movement, championed free speech and anti-war issues through theatrical, anti-authoritarian, symbolic politics such as cannabis smoke-ins. In this sketch, Rubin plays up the idea that the Yippies have sold out their 60s ideals by outright shilling wallpaper pre-scrawled with revolutionary slogans. It's a decent commentary on the co-opting of the counterculture to sell products, but is not funny in the slightest. Meh. In the Live from New York book, Lauren says, "The only note we got from the network on the first show was, 'cut the bees,' and so I made sure to put them in the next show. I had them come out and talk to Paul Simon. He says, 'It didn't work last week, it's cut,' and they go, 'Oh,' and just walk off." From everything I've read, there was some pretty heavy complaining by the folks in the ensemble this week, especially from Belushi. There was great concern among the writers and featured players that they would end up having a much smaller role on SNL than originally planned, and accusations that Lauren was more concerned with sucking up to his friend Paul Simon than in making them look good. It certainly didn't help matters that literally the only appearance most of them had this entire second episode was to be unceremoniously told to leave by Simon. A parody ad in which the pacemakers of 5 geriatrics are left running overnight to prove that the batteries wouldn't die. Cut to the morning and 4 are dead, with only the try-hard consumer still kicking. Hilarious. Paul closes the show with a wonderful solo rendition of American Tune, and then is presented a basketball trophy taller than he is, by Bill Bradley no less, in recognition of his victory over Connie Hawkins. It's an admittedly funny sight, and Paul nearly falls over. He's not joined on stage by the cast as would later become tradition though, which brings me to the biggest problem with this episode. There's very little of the not ready for primetime players. Even if they'd kept all the musical numbers, they still had room for some skits if they'd only cut the Rubin bit, the Muppets, and the asininely overlong basketball thing. Nevertheless, director Dave Wilson won one of SNL's 3 first-season Emmys for his work on it, and it's certainly an important moment in the history of the show. Next week's host is meathead Rob Reiner, who ended up being hated by nearly everyone on the show. Good times. Stay tuned.